How long has it been since someone who isn't an Uber driver tried to tell me the way that things should operate in this industry? Let's see what the Gravel Institute has to say about the way that my job should operate.
The company is worth $100 billion. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trips and delivery orders have been booked using its app. It gets tens of billions of dollars in revenue each year. Uber is everywhere, and the narrative of Uber is also everywhere. It says that Uber is innovative, that it can disrupt the taxi industry and make money doing it, and that it can offer flexibility and opportunity to its army of drivers. Everybody wins. There's one problem. None of that is true.
You say that none of that is true, but you're going to show examples where those very things are true later in this video. And especially when it comes to disrupting the taxi industry, there's really no argument that it hasn't disrupted the taxi industry. I would say that that's a good thing because maybe you don't remember the way it was before Uber came around, but I would say it's an improvement. Flexibility, as I mentioned in my last video about Uber, is the #1 benefit to driving for Uber. So saying there is no flexibility, I mean, that's just a non-starter.
Let's start with one basic fact. For a company so prominent, there's something very strange. Uber has never, not once, turned a single profit. You might be confused. How can it be that such a large company with such a popular service has simply never made money?
Tax loopholes and business model.
When you find out the answer, you discover something important. You discover that Uber is fundamentally a scam.
Well, that's a pretty strong word, but let's see exactly what you mean by it.
A company that exists to scam its investors.
This implies that investors somehow aren't aware of the fact that Uber exists as a loss leader. That is absurd. Now, you might not like the business model, but saying that this is a scam on investors is just patently false.
Its users.
Having watched this video twice now, I'm not sure where this comes in. Is that the primary means of Uber getting money from its users is by not providing them with the service it claims to be providing? I would say no. Now, maybe you don't like the way that it provides the service, but saying that's a scam is something entirely different.
And most importantly, to scam its workers.
Scam in this case primarily means, according to this video, exploitation. There's not paying drivers fairly or, of course, unexpected costs and that sort of thing. And I will agree with you. There are some costs that some drivers might not be aware of when they start driving. They might not be aware of the lack of benefits, for example, that sort of thing. However, if you are a driver who's that naive and you're getting into it without having done any research whatsoever, you have no idea of the problems with Uber, and there are problems with Uber. If you have no idea what these problems are and you just jump in and they just completely blindside you, that's on you, unfortunately. Now, if you are aware of these problems and you can deal with them, then you can thrive in this economy, whether or not Uber is, quote, scamming its drivers or not.
Despite everything you might hear, Uber is not a technology company. While the company may brag about its sophisticated algorithm, in reality, Uber is just another taxi company.
Uber has become just another taxi company because every other taxi company has had to innovate to catch up to Uber.
There's nothing fundamentally more efficient about Uber than there was with your local taxi service. The business is the same.
Fundamentally is a very strange word to stick into this sentence because it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. In practice, is it any different? Yes, absolutely, because back in the day, if you didn't live in New York and you weren't coming from an airport where you could just throw your hand up and get a ride, that meant you had to call the cab company and then wait an hour or 2 hours or however long it happened to take them, and maybe at some point you would get a ride. It's really a little different from the way it is now. Getting on your phone that already has your payment information stored and simply reserving a ride which shows up within minutes, that didn't happen back in the day. So saying it's no different, that's just false. Now saying it's fundamentally no different, yes, fundamentally you are still putting in a request for a ride. That ride is showing up if and when it wants to, and you are taking that ride where you want to go, and then you're paying for it. So fundamentally it's no different, but in practice it's absolutely, completely 100% different.
There's no real way to innovate someone driving someone or something from point A to point B. Using an app to match riders with drivers is so simple that local taxi companies do the same thing.
Really? So you actually took the word fundamental and then based your entire argument around it? Yes. Getting people from point A to point B has been a thing since since ancient times. Is that fundamentally different? No, I guess it isn't. Does that mean we should still be carrying people around on litters? I guess that would be the argument then, huh? Because carrying someone on a litter from point A to point B is fundamentally no different than driving them with a ride requested on your smartphone. Here you're saying that cab companies have the same capabilities as Uber. That is to say that Uber is no better than cab companies. Cab companies now have the option where you can get on an app, request a ride, and get a ride just the same way you can with Uber. Wow, what a coincidence. Now, before Uber existed, could you get on your smartphone, put in your payment information, request a cab through an app, see exactly where your cab was, how long it was going to take to get to you, and then follow your ride as it was coming to you? No, you couldn't. Why is that the case in some locations now? It's because of Uber. I mean, I know you don't want to admit this, but your initial argument was that there is no innovation on Uber. So yes, like in the last 5 minutes, there hasn't been an innovation on Uber. But has Uber innovated? Do you remember what it was like before Uber existed? Now, you're a Vice rider, and I imagine you're in New York City. So in New York City, yes, maybe things haven't changed all that much in New York City because there are still cabs everywhere. You throw up your hand, you get a ride. In the rest of the world, it might be a shock to you. That is not the situation. In the rest of the world, you have to call the cab company and just hope that you actually get a ride at some point. Maybe an hour or two later, someone actually shows up. And then once that happens, you get to pay out the ass for that ride. And of course, there are other scams and such that cab companies take part in. And I mentioned some of this in my last video, but that's really beside the point. If we go back 10 years ago, when cabs were the only game in town, and they could do whatever the hell they wanted, and there was no innovation in the last 80 years, and you're comparing that to present day. Has there been innovation? Yes. Why is that innovation taking place? It's because of Uber specifically.
In fact, Uber is less efficient than taxi companies. Most normal taxi companies don't spend huge amounts on marketing or lobbying or corporate headquarters. They don't pay their CEO $45 million a year. Uber has higher costs than traditional taxi operators in every category except fuel.
In terms of profit per mile, you are absolutely correct that cabs make more per mile than Ubers do. That's both as a company and on an individual driver basis. Absolutely, I will give you that. However, when I'm driving around at night and I see a cab sitting in a parking lot, I am well aware that on any given ride that cab is going to get paid way more than I am. However, that cab currently is sitting in that parking lot, meaning he's not getting paid and I am. So, in this less than zero-sum game, I don't really care how efficient that cab is. What I care about is how much money I'm making overall.
So why is Uber everywhere while taxi companies go out of business? It all goes back to Uber's master plan. First, with massive amounts of money from venture capitalists, Uber subsidized significantly cheaper rides than what taxi companies could offer to attract customers away from them.
Exactly what I said in my last video, and absolutely true.
Then, after years of undercutting competitors and driving them to bankruptcy...
Oh no, how awful. You mean the cab company's perfect monopoly has been disrupted? And I guess they just can't be profitable unless they have complete monopolistic control over the local markets. Funny, that seemed to be one of your complaints about Uber. But how terrible, they've lost that monopoly so they can't just gouge passengers for whatever the hell they feel like charging, and passengers are forced to pay it ridiculous fees for no reason whatsoever. How awful that so much of that has gone away thanks to the fact that cabs now have competition. Well, it's terrible. And even as cab companies lie to their passengers and try to fraudulently interfere with my ability to make money, you want me to feel sorry for them. Yeah, that's not happening. And if I can do my small part to drive the local cab companies out of business, I consider that a victory. So yeah, fuck the cabs.
Resulting in a wave of suicides by cab drivers.
This couldn't possibly have anything to do with the price of New York taxi medallions costing multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, even peaking at $1 million, driving taxi drivers into massive debt. No, that's perfectly fine. The city itself preying on its drivers. That's perfectly fine. The archaic indentured servitude business model that defines the taxi industry. That's perfectly fine too. No, Uber is the problem.
Uber established near monopolies in local markets. Now, Uber is often the default way to get around if you don't have a car. And once Uber has eradicated its competition, it can make itself profitable at expense of users and drivers, raising its fares to what taxis offered or higher, while pushing down drivers' wages.
I mentioned in my last video about Uber, I started driving during the absolute worst possible time. It was during that race to the bottom. It was the peak of that experience. Getting paid less and less overtime. Worst time of year, the worst possible market. I'd be sitting for 2 to 3 hours sometimes without a ride, getting paid $0 per hour. So yes, I'm well aware of how bad things can be when you're driving for Uber. Now, since that time, as I mentioned also, things have gotten better, but I'm aware that this can change at any moment's notice, and there are situations where you as a driver would be better off not driving. There are times and situations where you might be just breaking even or losing money if you are driving for Uber, wasting your time, making well under minimum wage, even as they mentioned in this video. You as a driver have to determine if the situation for you makes it worth driving for Uber.
The plan is not efficiency, it's monopoly.
That is 100% true.
And that's not just me theorizing. A 73-page article in the Transportation Law Journal took a deep look at Uber's business and concluded one thing. Uber has no ability, now or in the foreseeable future, to earn sustainable profits in a competitive marketplace.
Uber's entire business model has at its core destroying its competition. That is absolutely true.
Uber's investors cannot earn returns on the money they invest without achieving levels of market dominance that would allow them to exploit anti-competitive market power. So that is Uber's grand plan. It is not increasing the productivity or efficiency of the industry that it's in. It's subsidizing its rides with venture capital cash until it can build a monopoly and do whatever it wants. So users who buy Uber's narrative may be getting scammed, but no one is getting it worse than Uber's workers.
It's strange to me that this is a surprise to anyone. This has just been blatantly obvious since the moment I started driving for Uber 4 years ago. It really comes down to what is that equilibrium point where drivers are no longer going to be willing to drive, but there's going to be enough drivers around to cover demand. And what we're seeing right now is that there's a massive driver shortage for that very reason. So a lot of drivers, or would-be drivers, are sitting at home collecting checks. And so they're making money to not drive, and so they're not driving. So what's Uber doing? It's got this massive recruitment drive. It's got just benefits out the ass trying to get more drivers out. Unfortunately for Uber, it's not able to meet demand, but what are drivers getting right now? Drivers are getting massive promotions and quests and surges. For a driver right now, it's actually fantastic. But fast forward 6 months from now, it's actually going to be really bad again because all those former drivers, if they decide to come back, well, they're going to be competing with the current drivers, right? So it's this fluctuation. It all comes down to whether you as a driver are able to thrive in whatever your current market is. And the market changes over time. And so there are a lot of people who just aren't able to cut it. And I can, understand that and sympathize to some extent, but it's every man for himself out here. As I said that in my video, it's less than a zero-sum game because the whole is less than the sum of its parts when it comes to surges, quests, promotions, that sort of thing. You getting rides means I'm not getting rides, and vice versa. If I'm willing to undercut you and you stop driving and go do something else, that means more money for me in the long run. And the opposite is also true. If you're willing to work for peanuts to the point where I'm no longer willing to drive, eventually I'm going to stop driving, and then you're going to get those rides to make more money in the long run. But this is all baked into the models, so I don't see why this is a surprise to anyone. Ubers compete with each other, we compete with the Lyfts, we compete with the cabs. But this notion that Uber drivers are just like some monolith that try to work together for some common goal is a fantasy. This is not the way things actually work in reality. If you're a driver, you want my rides, and if you're a driver, I want your rides. And there's really no way to reconcile that. Even if we were, as is often presented, paid, for example, a minimum wage, and it became just a job, which I think is a terrible solution, as I mentioned in the last video I made about Uber. Even if that were the case, there would be some number of drivers that would simply be cut. And again, it's competition. It's, am I getting the job or are you getting the job? Right now, it's, am I getting the ride or are you getting the ride? But if it switches to who does and doesn't have a job at the end of the day, it's the same exact thing. You can work harder, you can work smarter, you can work harder and smarter, or you can go cry about how you're not being paid enough and see how well that works out for you.
So, Uber relies on classifying drivers as independent contractors. In the United States, that means an individual provides services to a company, but is independent of the company and its control. Uber says that because drivers can choose what work to accept and for how long, they're fully independent.
Yes, the notion that drivers are completely independent is a fantasy. It is, in fact, a loophole. However, given the expected results, should drivers be classified as employees, it is a loophole I am more than happy to exist within. I talk about this at great length in my last video, that is the expected consequences should drivers be reclassified as employees. For many people, it would just be completely disastrous. Taking the number one reason to be any part of the gig economy and throwing it in the trash, and then replacing it with perhaps benefits that are actually worse than what you might be getting now. This depends a great deal on your market and the individual circumstances that you find yourself in as a driver. But this one-size-fits-all notion that's being presented is just not reality.
Now, most of Uber's workers drive part-time, but they actually do relatively little driving, and 90% of them quit each year. The majority of Uber's labor is done by a smaller group of workers who drive full-time for the company.
Oh, hey, that's me.
So who are these drivers? In cities like New York, the vast majority are immigrants from places like India, Bangladesh, and Haiti. They desperately need cash to support their families and send remittances back home. These are people at the very margins of our society. And how does Uber treat them? Uber treats them like a pool of cheap labor, easy to exploit and then discard.
I find this segment of the video a bit strange. It's, won't someone please think of the immigrants? I can certainly respect the hustle. So if you're working hard and sending money, remittances to family elsewhere, I can certainly respect that. But you don't also get my sympathy. There's just the implication that things are bad and things should be better. So did these drivers choose to drive for Uber? I guess they have no agency of their own is what's being presented here. Are things so bad that they would like to go work in some other industry? There's no indication of that whatsoever. It's just they are currently driving for Uber, and I guess they need the money more than other drivers both in New York City and elsewhere. And so think of the poor drivers. Don't they have it so bad? Do they have it bad? I don't know. I would think if they did have it so bad, they would decide to do something else. You're looking at an industry or a job where literally anyone with a car, a clean background check, a driver's license, and appropriate insurance and whatnot can drive as little or as much as they like. Of course, some people do this full time. What you're showing is, I guess, people who do this full time, at least in this particular instance, they're just not making enough money. And realize also that this is someone's competition. So you're not talking about the other Uber drivers in New York who are not immigrants sending remittances to family. You're not talking about Uber drivers elsewhere. But this particular group, they really need this money. So think of the poor immigrants. Okay. A lot of people haven't thought their way through this, but Uber drivers compete with each other. So what you're showing is this is someone's competition, but I guess they deserve the money more than their competition does. So, okay. This is not my competition, so it doesn't affect me, but if I were a driver in New York City, I'd be pretty annoyed by this. Now, as an Uber driver who is aware that drivers compete with each other, I know the answer to this, but have you even thought about it? Is what is the simplest way to improve the circumstances for this group of poor immigrants being held up? It's to fire every other Uber driver on the road. So you say, are you a poor immigrant sending remittances to family? Well, I guess you get to keep your job. But if you're not, if you're anyone else on the road, the best thing for these immigrants is for you to not be there, so you get cut. There's no real way to reconcile that. This is why I find it so strange. You're holding up this one group. They deserve better. But in order for them to get better, everyone else is going to be worse off in one way or another. I find it interesting also that you're choosing a group of drivers in New York because when it comes to Uber drivers and the differences in markets, I think what happens in New York should stay in New York. There's this false notion that whatever is good for drivers in New York is just good for drivers across the board. So frankly, whatever the policies are in New York for the semi-collectivized drivers there, I don't care what they want to do. Keep that stuff in New York and away from me, and let me make my own decisions where I am. Thank you very much.
Uber's always been clear about one thing. It does not care about its drivers.
I'll agree with you. For the most part, Uber has not cared about its drivers, and for this I'll cite Kalanick himself.
At Uber's Greenlight centers, where drivers register with the company, they were not even allowed to enter bathrooms reserved for employees.
That's, I can't say I'm surprised.
In fact, when Uber was talking about how it would become profitable, it stated clearly that it wanted to get rid of its drivers and transition entirely to self-driving cars. But Uber's technology was so bad that after burning billions of dollars, it had to give up. So for now, Uber is stuck with its drivers.
Yes, this is absolutely true. And as a driver, of course, I've been well aware of this. And this is also why, as a professional driver, I'm well aware of how expendable I am. Uber could cut me tonight without a second thought. Yes, I'm well aware of this. But this is also why Uber is not a career. I fully expect at some point Uber is going to completely implode, and when it does, I'm going to jump ship and do something else. But at least for now, Uber is something that, for me personally, in this market is worth doing.
And in order to appear like it's coming closer to profitability, it's been cutting their wages since 2015. Whenever Uber increases its cut from each trip or reduces the minimum rate for drivers, its margins improve by that much immediately.
Yes, that is true, and as I mentioned, I started driving during the absolute worst time to start driving. Back at the time, there were some cities where even the base mileage rates probably were not enough to cover your gas expenses, much less make a living on. But again, this varies by your market. And frankly, all this means is that there were too many drivers in these different markets. So as driver turnover occurred in many places, the situation has improved. Of course, Kalanick was removed and replaced, and there have been a number of changes since then. But really, I notice you aren't accounting for the other means of making money as you're driving for Uber. You aren't talking about surges, promotions, or quests, which are the primary means of making up that difference. Yes, if you're looking at your base rates on Uber are frankly terrible. But when you add in all these other ways of making money on Uber, if you are making money and if you're driving full-time, then you can make a pretty decent living right now. Except I didn't tell you that because I don't want you to drive. Stop driving. No, driving is terrible. Don't drive for Uber. Don't sign up. Don't sign up. Go away.
As a result, Uber drivers regularly earn less than the minimum wage. After taking hidden costs like fuel into account, the average Uber driver earns a little over $9 an hour, about 50% less than what taxi drivers made before Uber.
And if you are an Uber driver and you are driving in a location where you're making, say, under minimum wage, realize that is your decision. Just as I was driving for $0 an hour 4 years ago, that was my decision. As I stuck with it, eventually I started making some real money. If you aren't satisfied with the amount that you're making per hour, perhaps you should quit. And if you quit, realize that makes things better for every other driver who's out there who is willing to continue working, and that does include the immigrants in New York who you're so concerned about. So as people quit and stop driving for Uber, that will actually make things better for them. Just as if you are in my market and you stop driving, that makes things better for me.
In fact, half of Uber drivers live at or below the poverty level.
I can't really say I'm surprised by that, but again, it depends on your individual market.
20% of them have to use food stamps to survive.
It's funny you say that because back when I started driving for Uber, back in the bad old days, back when I was making $0 an hour to sit in parking lots, back then, the moment I started driving for Uber, I became ineligible for food stamps. So I was making so much money by making $0 an hour that I became ineligible for any sort of assistance whatsoever.
Unable to afford a home, some drivers even sleep in their cars.
I have very little sympathy for these drivers, especially because many of them are choosing to do so in order to save on costs. And of course, I can respect that, but then I don't also have sympathy for you when you do it. So the idea is that a driver in a place like San Francisco can make ass loads of money, but rent in a place like San Francisco is going to cost way too much. So a driver from outside San Francisco will come into the city, and then as part of the calculated expenses of doing business, they will, rather than renting a hotel room or getting an apartment or something like that, they'll just sleep in their cars. So that's part of the cost of doing business and part of what they themselves have signed up for. And I don't particularly have sympathy for these people, but I do respect the hustle. You can't have it both ways. You don't get my sympathy for having to sleep in your car while also choosing to do that because it makes you more money.
Drivers with nothing to their name get trapped in predatory car rental schemes promoted by Uber. They garnish your wages until you've paid it off with interest.
This is not something that's available here locally where I am, but yes, this is predatory. And unfortunately, it's something where people who are getting into these deals should read the fine print before they sign the paperwork. If you are required to make a payment of X dollars per month and then you don't make that payment in this sort of rent-to-own scheme, then you're going to lose your investment and your means of making money in this case. So yeah, it's unfortunate for these drivers. As I mentioned, every driver on the road makes it worse for every other driver. If you're taking out a loan specifically so you can be my competition, then I can't really feel bad for you when you fail.
One study from Georgetown found that a third of drivers reported falling into a debt trap. Some ended up earning less than $5 an hour.
I had to record this a few times because I didn't realize just how stupid the Ballad of Beatrice was. Now, if you show this to someone who doesn't know any better, Beatrice netted less than $5 per hour. How tragic. I guess she should be paid more, right? No, Beatrice is a complete moron who has no business driving for Uber. Let's break it down. First off, Uber took out its 25% commission and booking fees. What does that mean? It means Beatrice made an astonishingly high 75%. A lot of people are under the misconception that Uber actually pays 90% of what you pay to Uber to its drivers. And I don't know where this fantasy came from, but that has, for as long as I've driven, never been the case. In reality, it's typically between 45 and 65%. 75% that Beatrice is making is fucking phenomenal. Right off the bat, something is very wrong with this example. You see that after Uber took out its commission and booking fees, she earned about $300, and this was driving for 14 hours. So as a driver, I see this, and this is exactly on par with what I would expect. $300 divided by 14 hours is $21.43 per hour, which is pretty decent, and wherever you are in the United States, this is above minimum wage. But then we see the actual problem here. She deducted from that $300, the $170 for the lease payment and $63 for vehicle insurance. The insurance seems a bit high, but maybe that just depends on where she lives. The $170 for the lease. This, again, makes no sense to me. The best thing to do is to get between a 6 to 10-year-old vehicle where depreciation has already taken place, buy it outright, get something reasonably reliable, and then just drive it into the ground as you use it for Uber, because people will destroy your car. The worst thing to do is to get a brand new vehicle because depreciation is going to cut into whatever you make. Tax deductible is not the same as free. For the vast majority of people, getting an older vehicle is going to net you more money in the long run. Doing some very quick Google searching, the average cost of leasing a new vehicle is $467 per month. So Beatrice's $170 per week is well over the cost of leasing a brand new vehicle just on average. If Beatrice had just bought a brand new vehicle, the average monthly payment on an auto loan for a brand new car is $568 per month. So Beatrice is paying 20% more for her lease. And leases are less expensive than buying cars. Beatrice is spending 20% more on her lease than if she had just bought a brand new car. This makes zero sense. But whatever, that's her choice. She can spend money out the ass. I guess Beatrice just has tons of money to spend because as someone who does Uber for a living, I would never do anything remotely like this. This makes zero sense. Beatrice, for whatever reason, chose the most expensive option possible. Okay, whatever. Beatrice, in this particular week, made $300. But if we subtract her expenses of $170 for the lease and $63 for the vehicle insurance, what we're left with is $67. And $67 over 14 hours is $4.79 per hour. And that sounds terrible, doesn't it? How is Beatrice supposed to survive on $4.79 per hour? That sounds terrible. But then, as an Uber driver, I look at this and I'm wondering, what was Beatrice doing with her week? 14 hours on Uber, that's nothing. In reality, Beatrice made $21.43 per hour. But then, for whatever reason, she chose to not drive, and so the vast majority of what she made went to her pointless expenses. Let's do some very quick math here. If Beatrice drove at her rate of $21.43 per hour, which is what was averaged over 14 hours, if she drove for one additional hour, at 15 hours instead of 14, she would have made $5.87 per hour, increasing by almost 25% what she made per hour. And that's after her expenses there. If she drove for 16 hours instead of 14, she would have averaged $6.86 per hour. So again, I look at this and I say $5 per hour. Beatrice had only herself to blame because she didn't actually do any driving. If Beatrice had driven for, I guess, what is an inconceivable 40 hours that week, after those same expenses, Beatrice would have made $15.60 per hour, which is, again, above minimum wage wherever you happen to be. And that's after her expenses right there. So Beatrice has only herself to blame. Beatrice is spending the vast majority of what little she actually made on Uber on her pointlessly high expenses. Am I supposed to feel sorry for this person? This person who didn't actually do any driving. 14 hours, what's that? Some drivers do that in one day. That's 2 very easy days of driving. What was she doing with the other 154 hours that week? Because clearly she wasn't driving. This is ostensibly an Uber driver, but this is an Uber driver who didn't actually do any Uber driving. Beatrice making less than $5 per hour has only herself to blame. That's the take home here. Let's consider what this example actually shows. Beatrice is not an Uber driver. That is to say, Beatrice does not make her living driving for Uber. If she did, she would be driving for well over 14 hours, and she wouldn't be making under $5 per hour after her expenses, because no part of this example makes any sense. She's getting an astonishingly high 75%, but for some reason that's just not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because Beatrice is incredibly lazy. So what actually is Beatrice? Beatrice is someone who wanted a brand new car. Because this car payment, the amount being shown here, makes zero sense. This is well above the average cost of leasing a brand new vehicle. This is even 20% higher than the average cost of buying a brand new vehicle. Beatrice wasn't going to be happy with a 6-year-old Honda Civic. Beatrice wanted a brand new car. Unfortunately for Beatrice, there is no such thing as a free lunch. When the payment came due, she was shocked to find that she only made about $60 after exorbitantly high car payment fees were taken out of what little she actually made for her minuscule amount of driving on Uber. That said, for as little as Beatrice made, what she did get out of the arrangement is a brand new car. So Beatrice can ride around in style doing whatever it is that Beatrice does that doesn't involve driving for Uber. There are two possibilities here, and frankly, I don't know which is worse. In one possibility, Beatrice is in the exact situation that Beatrice wants to be in. In fact, if she could, I'm sure she'd be making $0 per hour on Uber, because for her tax basis, adjusted gross income, and how that interacts with whatever other income Beatrice might be getting, this might be the best solution. Unfortunately for Beatrice, she actually had a bit of net income that week. What Beatrice is getting is that for the other 154 hours of the week, she has access to a brand new car that she can use for whatever reason she likes. So Beatrice making under $5 an hour is 100% Beatrice's own decision. Now, if that's the case, Beatrice can maintain this situation for as long as she likes, making her ridiculously high car payments till she no longer actually needs the car for what she's using it for outside of Uber. At that point, she can return the car and drop the facade that she is an Uber driver. The second possibility is that Beatrice is in fact too stupid to be a private contractor. If somehow Beatrice hasn't realized that her fixed costs scale downward as a percentage of her total revenue with the more money she makes over time and the more time she spends working during the week, she has no business being a private contractor. And if that's the case, then Beatrice should go work a 9 to 5 where she doesn't have to make any financial decisions whatsoever.
And because its drivers are technically independent contractors, Uber can avoid pesky requirements like minimum wages, health insurance, or paid sick leave.
I talked about this extensively in my last video. All those pesky requirements would cut into drivers' pay. You, as a driver, would have to determine if in your individual market, the benefits that are currently not being provided to you are worth more than whatever pay you're getting now. Last night, off season, a very easy night of driving, I made double minimum wage average across the night. And if you're in a situation where you're hardly making anything driving for Uber because of your market, then maybe for you these different benefits would be better than the rate that you're making now. But at least for me in this market, I would not want to take a pay cut to get these added benefits, which might not even be as good as they're being presented as.
Drivers can't unionize to bargain for better conditions.
If you think I want to be in the same bargaining pool as Beatrice, you got another thing coming. Drivers exist independently. Just because you want something doesn't mean I want it, and vice versa. And I certainly don't want someone bargaining on my behalf for things that I don't want. And as I also mentioned in my last video, the worse things are for other drivers, the better things are for me individually, and the same goes in reverse. The worse things are for me, the better they are for other drivers who continue driving. This whole equity notion where everything's just going to be straight across the board means you're going to have other consequences that are not being presented here at all. If you have collective bargaining, then those drivers who are more competent and efficient are going to be wasting their own money, resources, time, energy, etc. On behalf of people who are benefiting at the expense of these more competent drivers.
Uber has all the power, and it makes sure it can stay that way. When California tried to classify drivers as employees, Uber spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a campaign to overturn it with a ballot proposition written by Uber's lawyers.
Number one, I wouldn't expect the Uber drivers themselves to come up with the propositions, because I imagine most of them don't have law degrees. Second, how does this fit in with what Uber drivers themselves want? Most drivers are not politically active. And I'm not talking about people who claim to speak on behalf of drivers, I'm talking about the drivers themselves. California, interestingly enough, has already seen firsthand the negative consequences of reclassifying gig economy workers as employees. The negative consequences of that for the employees themselves. So it's not really surprising that a lot of drivers don't want to be employees, especially in California.
And even though Uber talks about flexibility, that's not what drivers actually experience. Drivers may not have physical bosses to order them around, but they're ruled by something even worse, an algorithmic overseer that's more intrusive than any flesh and blood boss could ever be.
I'm going to let you in on a little secret here, and that's you can turn the app off anytime you like. And oftentimes turning the app off is the best thing to do, especially if you're in a busy market. Before you even swipe to start the trip, just turn the app off so you make sure you don't get hit with additional rides that you weren't prepared for. One exception to this is if you're on a promotion, but even then you can turn the app off while you're in the ride, and then as you're nearing the end of it, turn it back on. So this is like a self-imposed problem, and maybe it's a situation where people are just too naive and they don't understand how the app works. If you are letting the Uber app oppress you, it's because you are allowing the Uber app to oppress you.
Uber's only actual innovations are in surveilling and disciplining its workforce.
I've said for a long time the Uber app is like a carrot and a stick, but there's no carrot. However, you can work around it.
They're always watching, monitoring driving behavior.
I don't see where this specifically is a problem.
Calculating fraud profiles,
Yes, that is very true, and one of the main problems I have with Uber Eats.
Using invisible secret functions to discipline drivers as well as customers.
Most of this is psychological, but yes, that is true.
FallBalone arbitrary threshold for ratings? Fired.
There's a simple solution to that. It's to not fall below that arbitrary threshold.
Reject too many trips because you don't want to lose any money? Fired.
Unfortunately, there's a simple solution to that too, and it's turn the app off when you aren't ready to accept rides. It's very simple.
Did a customer make a false report? Fired.
I mentioned I had someone try and do this to me. I've talked to other drivers. It's happened to them. And it is unfortunate, but on Uber, you are guilty until proven innocent as a driver, and this is something where I will agree with you. However, completely changing the business model for that reason is not something that I'm going to get behind.
So that's the freedom that Uber offers.
No, the freedom is the ability to get on and off whenever you like, and really that's the important thing that you're not mentioning here. You can drive as little as one trip every 3 months and still be active on the app, at least last I checked. Or you can drive effectively as much as you like, and really that just comes down to you and your preferences. It's a huge difference that is not being acknowledged here. That is having to come in 9 to 5, you must be at work, you must be on the job every single day, doing what someone else tells you to do, versus getting on and off whenever you like, for any reason, at any time. That is a huge difference.
It frees drivers to make below minimum wage, to sleep in their cars, to beg for 5-star ratings, and work themselves to the bone.
Again, this all comes down to your markets. Nothing is guaranteed, but if you're working for below minimum wage and you're not happy with the situation, you can simply stop and go do something else. But you are in competition with the other drivers, so if you're going about things in a particularly bad way and you aren't willing to accept the consequences of that, then yes, I hope you make less than minimum wage and I hope you go do something else.
But at the end of the day, Uber, like other gig companies, is an innovator. Not in technology, but in exploitation. It's leading the war against labor in ways other companies never thought possible. It oversees a pool of atomized, ultra-exploited laborers, writes its own regulations, and has done it all without earning a single cent of profit. Imagine what sort of world they'll need to start making one. I'm Edward Ongweso Jr., staff writer at Vice for the Gravel Institute.
Oh boy. Don't get me wrong, Uber has a ton of problems, and some of these problems were even presented somewhat fairly in this Gravel Institute video. But as I've seen many times now, the concerns of people who claim to advocate on behalf of Uber drivers are often very different from the concerns of Uber drivers themselves. It's interesting to note that in this video there are no real solutions presented. There are lots of problems, or things that are ostensibly problems, but there's no real solution being presented. So all we're left with is implications of what the solutions could be. Of course, employment being chief among them, but also different protections and just benefits for drivers, I suppose. As I mentioned in my last video on Uber, there are several different interest groups, and their interests don't necessarily align. So yes, I'm well aware that Uber throws its drivers under the bus in a number of different ways. But as a driver, it is up to you as an individual to deal with that situation and either make the best of it and thrive in that situation, or go do something else. What I'm not willing to do is advocate for complete change in the business model and the structure of what I do for a living on behalf of those who apparently have no business doing this in the first place, because I guess they're just not cut out for being private contractors. If you want to go do a 9 to 5 and get the benefits of doing a 9 to 5, go do a 9 to 5. Don't come into a business without having read the fine print and then complain about the fact that you're not being catered to. I think the thing that annoys me the most about this video is that for all the problems being presented and the implied solutions, none of those solutions are really being investigated. So what you're left with is the current situation is bad, therefore it should be changed. But we're not going to tell you how it should be changed, but it should be changed. And therefore any change presumably is good. That's what you're left with. I talked about in my last video extensively what these different changes would look like and the unforeseen consequences of these changes. None of these are being presented in this video. Nothing like this is even hinted at in this video. So yes, minimum wage in concept is great, but how's that going to look on paper? It's going to be a pay cut. Health insurance, great. What's that going to look like? It's going to be a pay cut. The number one benefit of being an Uber driver, as I mentioned, is the fact that it is flexible. The flexibility is somehow presented as a detriment in this video. I don't really understand that, but the number one reason to be any part of the gig economy is presented as a bad thing. What you're left with is that any alternative would be better. What does that alternative look like? It's working 9 to 5, which if you're an Uber driver would be a complete disaster. If you think the Eye of Sauron, the Uber app watching over you, is bad now, Wait to see what happens when it's more like, say, working for FedEx or something. It's going to be that much worse. Or working for a bus service. These are all alternatives that you can look at today and see what they look like. So, maybe you're happy with that sort of work. But me, as someone who likes to get on and off when I like, that would be a disaster. So that's just not presented at all. Any change would be good. And especially look at all these people who have no idea what they're doing, have no business being private contractors, are now in way over their head. When we pull out a violin, play some sad music for them. But, that's presented as the reason that the entire business model should change. So rather than people making the best of the situation and thriving in that economy, it's let's change everything to accommodate the people who are least qualified to be contractors in the first place. I just can't abide by that. And as I've mentioned, it's every driver for himself out here, and that's the logical conclusion. That's the logical situation for a number of reasons. It's not just the way it is, it's the way it should be. Because if it weren't that situation, then it would be drivers taking advantage of each other to work as little as possible, which is what you see in a lot of other jobs, actually. I saw this video from Gravel and just instantly knew I had to make a response to it. This is exemplary of exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about, which is individuals with no experience doing the work themselves coming in and trying to claim they know what's best. In this case, it can't even go that far because there's just the implication. Nothing is pinned down. Nothing is stated outright as here's the solution. Because if that solution were presented, it could be just ripped apart. It's saying, wouldn't it be great if this were changed or that were changed without looking at the implications of making those changes? And then on the side, here's a sob story about someone who had no idea what they're doing and no business doing the work in the first place. If you want to spend at least a few months driving for Uber full time, then I'll be interested to listen to your solutions. And for everyone else, thanks for watching. Have a good one.